Good day. Today we'll be reading about slavery and abolition in Brazil. It is estimated that more than a third of all Africans shipped to the New World as slaves, 60% of those being shipped in the 19th century, came to Brazil. The Portuguese dominated the Atlantic slave trade, and the successive economic cycles in which cheap labor fueled prosperity, sugar, then cacao, then mining, then coffee, encouraged Brazil's elites to hold on to the system as long as possible. Plantation owners took their crops for granted and did nothing to preserve the fertility of the land. Many did not even keep accounts of the costs and returns. As a tribute to Sergio Barque de Holanda, they were the miners of the rich soil, not the farmers, speculators, rather the cultivators. They treated their slaves as they were beasts of the burden and as replaceable as oxen. In 1822, the year Brazil won its freedom from Portugal, slaves constituted as much as half of the nation's population. The slave trade had been banned in 1817, but it only stopped after 1850 when the British, motivating newfound morality in foreign policy, threatened Brazil with a naval blockade. Slaves lived under miserable conditions because owners felt it more efficient to buy newly arrived Africans than to take care of the ones they already owned. Slaves, mixed-race landless farmers, and floating bands of cowboy drifters, Valenjois, populated most of the country's hinterland. Coastal cities grew. Along the mainstay of their economies was commercial, not industrial. The backlands, however, remained impoverished, with the price of slaves rising steadily after mid-century, when the British forced the imperial Brazilian government to stop the slave trade in the vast stretches of the northeast. Landowners shut down their agricultural properties and moved to the cities of the coast, turning over their lands and frequently lacking the regular sources of potable water to sharecroppers who raised subsistence crop under the watchful eyes of overseers. Large numbers of men lacking work in congregated in the rural towns. The unemployed, especially free men of color, were often conscripted forcibly into the army, but they were kept from running away by a regime of brutal discipline. It is telling that the end of the slave trade, after decades of stalling by Brazilian officials, spurred economic development in the center-south. This occurred as foreign capital poured in seeking investment, especially in transportation, in response to the growing prosperity of the Paraíba Valley coffee plantations. Slavery reigned supreme, but gradually the economy diversified. Between 1850 and 1860, the number of corporations boomed, ventures in manufacturing, railroads, insurance, mining, savings bank, and land settlements. The first railroad opened in 1854, and the first telegraph system started in 1857. But not only did a few rail lines link mines and plantation to Brazilian ports, but a suburban train, the Dom Pedro II, later Centro do Brasil, connected Rio de Janeiro to the working-class districts beyond the city's limits. Foreign engineers brought the first illuminated streetlights to the capital in 1854, replacing lamps fueled by foul-smelling fish oil. Street cars pulled mules, later propelled by electricity, arrived a decade later, as did sewage disposal systems in major cities. Yet as late as 1889, Rio de Janeiro, the national capital, remained an old colonial borough with narrow, dirty streets, poorly maintained houses, peeling hordes, and potholed pavements, and dusty shops. Economic cycles displaced one region and another in prominence and profitability. Economic decline in northeastern Brazil, the result of lower prices of sugar produced in the Caribbean and Louisiana, led many plantation owners to sell their slave sows to the mines, ranches, and the coffee plantations of Minas Gerais and Sao Paulo. The shortage of slaves in southern Brazil was due to a large and low birth rate among slave women and the high indecent rate of slave mothers and childbirth. By the mid-19th century, moreover, many slave owners had manumitted their slave property less out of charity than as an economic measure, because slaves over the age of 40 were less productive. Also, Brazilian slave owners sometimes freed slave women who gave birth to their illegitimate children. The adult manumission rate for women was double that of men. Brazilian society did not know what to do with so many children born to whites and slave women, and as a result of thousands of foundlings were placed in the care of religious institutions. Some churches had revolving doors. Infants could be placed outside a shelf, which was swindled to inside so that the child would be discovered without ever seeing the faces of the people who had abandoned it. The emperor worked with the Liberal Party leaders to implement a gradual program of the emancipation of slaves, and the Rio Branco Law of 1871 freed children born to slave mothers, although planters could keep them for a small payment until they reached the age of 21. It was named for Viscount Rio Branco José Maria de Silva Pranjas, a conservative in his youth who had been educated in an imperial military academy, but whose outlook became more liberal as he matured into a leading imperial statesman. During Rio Branco's term as Prime Minister, Brazil reformed and enlarged public education, organized the first national census in 1872, invited foreign investors to build railroads linking rural agricultural regions to ports, creating a modern post office, reformed the criminal code and civil codes, promoted immigration from Northern Europe. He also saw the induction of the metric system and increased European contacts. The initiatives to weaken the hold of slavery did not have the desired effect, and the provisions for Rio Branco law were widely ignored. The law made no provision for enforcement. The metric system was not applied universally, and in the hinterland, local citizens, fearing that fees and taxes would be raised, more accurate weights and measures smashed metric equipment in marketplaces and riots in the 1870s, known as the crib a kilos, smash kilos. Economic hard times during this decade made the enforcement of reform laws even more difficult. A second national law regarding slavery in 1885 freed bondsmen over the age of 60, an age reached by few in the 19th century when productive labor was unlikely. On May 3rd, 1888, Princess Regent Isabel, acting in the name of her father, Pedro II, was traveling and signed the Golden Law, which ratified by the General Assembly of Parliament and emancipated all Brazil's remaining slaves. Abolitionist sentiment had been fueled by the embarrassment of the fact that with emancipations of slaves in the United States, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, and of the serfs and chattel slaves in Tsarist Russia, Brazil stood out as the last independent nation in the world where slavery remained legal. Yet Princess Isabel's act was mostly symbolic. Very few slaves were left, and their role in the economy had been replaced with members of the lower class hired for day wages and by immigrants from around the world induced to come to Brazil by planters and provincial governments who paid ship passage for indentured workers. But if the abolition decree was largely symbolic, it was powerful enough to bring the monarchy to its end. A year after the Golden Law, Rui Barbarossa, the finance minister and jurist who would write most of the 1891 Constitution, ordered the government slave registers burned, a sign that Brazil was entering into a new era. This was true traditionally, but the former slaves and free blacks remained at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and the abolitionist movement, which had argued that slavery was both immoral and efficient, vanished overnight, and its former rulers giving no attention to the plight of ex-slaves, who now faced destitution if their former owners turned their backs on them. One group usually overlooked in the history of slavery were the overseers. They were the Portuguese immigrants, although sometimes free blacks and even trusty slaves were given the job of watching and disciplining field slaves. Their onerous jobs positioned the overseers in an awkward position. The slaves they punished hated them and sometimes murdered them, yet slave owners frankly did not trust them either. Some overseers managed to acquire their own land, and slaves managed to earn the trust of the slaves under their whip. Abolitionists. Abolitionists in Brazil differed from their counterparts in the United States in approach and strategies. American abolitionists lived and appealed to inhabitants of the states in which slavery was not present, demanding that the federal government declare slavery legal. In many cases, they continued their trade after the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, protesting against unequal treatment given to blacks, although ex-slaves in the South, not in their own backyards. In Brazil, the abolitionists lived much closer to the institution, which was nationwide. Abolitionists in the United States portrayed slave owners as brutes. In Brazil, the abolitionists were to ascribe savagery to slaves whom they saw as victimized by the barbarism of their African ancestry. In the United States, many abolitionists drew inspiration from Christianity and therefore worked not only to outlaw slavery but to redeem African Americans from poverty. Many abolitionists in the United States worked for black rights, although social barriers restricted progress. Once emancipation was achieved in Brazil, the abolitionists shifted their attention to other causes, including republicanism, and did nothing to help the newly freed blacks prepared for living as free people in a new society. Not all Brazilian abolitionists avoided more arguments. Antonio Bento, a Paulista who had been compared to the radical American abolitionist John Brown, denounced slavery on moral grounds. Joaquim Ariel de Ashujo, the son of a powerful landowner and senator, spoke eloquently against slavery as an institution. He hated slavery from the first time he saw it and spent most of his life working for its eradication. A diplomat, he was posted to England to the United States, permitted to mainly contact with the anti-slavery groups. He was an eloquent orator and wrote fiercely, mincing no words during a time in the middle 19th century when society expected criticism to be indirect and subtle. In some, Brazilian abolitionists wrote and spoke as individuals. There were few abolitionist societies or organizations, and many of their arguments against slavery were not made on principled grounds, but against the economic cost, the immortality of the institution. For instance, European immigrants, considered far more desirable than African bondsmen, were dissuaded from coming to Brazil. Once abolition was achieved, the abolitionist cause ended abruptly. Attention shifted to encouraging overseas immigrants. No voices were raised, warning of the difficulties of the ex-slaves by face of abandoned to fend for themselves. Slavery had a few escape hatches. Individuals could purchase their freedom or be manumitted, although in many cases freed slaves had remained in voluntary servitude until the master or his wife died. Other slaves ran away. Most never died in captivity. In contrast to most of the Latin America, which abolished slavery in the early 19th century, Brazil retained slavery as a legal institution until 1888. Emancipation brought cries of joy from the 5% black Brazilians still in bondage in 1888, but it was accomplished by legislation and social pressures that served to limit the drastically opportunities for blacks and keep them